All right, I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Tom Culbert, who is a Senior Manager at Accenture Strategy. At Accenture, Tom leads the Perth-based practice, primarily working with executives in the resources sector to transform their operations and organisations and navigate the energy transition. He has also been advising utilities companies on how they can lead Australia into a hydrogen future, and that's exactly what he'll be discussing today. I'll now hand over to you, Tom, to lead that discussion.
Great, thank you very much. Now, is my screen coming through okay? Can everyone hear me?
It's starting to load up. Yep, we're good to go now.
Cool. I was hoping to be in the office today, but with our snap lockdown, I'm outside my daughter's bedroom, so fingers crossed we don't get interrupted for the next 30. So thanks very much. Look, I wanted to talk really about a publication that Accenture came out with a number of months back, which is around how we think utilities position in this kind of green hydrogen sector. So maybe just a bit of context. So the company I work with, Accenture, I'm part of the strategy practice. So our focus is primarily working with executives in a management capacity rather than technical services. And that could be corporate strategy, anything around M&A, looking at growth to new markets, as well as operations, which is typically around right sizing and cost efficiencies. We've done a lot of work globally with the World Economic Forum. We're in the Hydrogen Council in Europe and have a number of thought leadership pieces. But very specifically, we wanted to look at the role of utilities in Australia around green hydrogen, which is one I want to share with you today. So just to kind of level set a bit, certainly in a lot of our client conversations, the hydrogen topic typically comes up in the themes of export as the primary demand driver, and really looking towards oil and gas industry as the area for investment, given the deeper pockets that industry typically has, and its ability to deploy large amounts of capital into kind of high risk projects. If we look at where we see the opportunities in the near term, and in near term we're talking kind of 5 to 10 years versus out to that 2050 state, we see quite a different view. We think it's going to be a much bigger focus on domestic markets, and we think really big investment into blue has a large stranded asset risk associated with it. Therefore, green hydrogen makes sense longer term, and that naturally positions, in our view, a role for utilities to really start to lead this industry early. So the 4 things I really wanted to talk through are why green and why utilities. And then with the utilities perspective, what would be the typical domestic markets that we think would be targeted? What are the relationships that we think companies will need to form in order to lead in this sector? And then very lastly, kind of where to invest next in order to move towards this. So reflecting on some analysis from the International Energy Agency, where they looked at the 2019 versus 2050 states, you can see if we compare kind of blue, gray, green, then there's not really a huge degree of efficiency gains to be realized in either blue or gray hydrogen. And then whilst green is clearly very expensive today, everyone has pretty ambitious cost targets around how that cost can come down. And then if we think about that in terms of the cost drives to get there, and I'm sure you probably saw different charts this morning around what's going to get there, beyond the OEM CapEx or efficiency improvements, clearly the cost of electricity is going to be a significant factor, as well as the firmability of that and the load potential. And it's really in that point that we see the role for utilities to then take the lead in the green hydrogen cost out. So what do we think would need to change, or what do we think are some of the lessons that utilities could leverage? So firstly, as I mentioned, we think it's really the shift from export markets to domestic markets. Now, I'm also very conscious in this point, having attended a few other of these events, and hearing from the investors in large green hydrogen projects that, you know, they've been very interested in domestic markets, but haven't necessarily seen that demand. And therefore, you know, the reasons why Murchison and Asian renewable energy hubs are targeting the likes of the Asian markets is really that opportunity to scale. So, you know, we're not blindly ignoring that point, but we'd also think that across the board for other companies looking to enter into green hydrogen and start to deliver scale, then competing in essentially more competitive global markets is going to be tougher, and then obviously has additional transport costs that increase the delivered cost. So therefore, we think domestic markets should be a more attractive initial opportunity. The second point is around the need to shift to more collaboration versus competitive mindsets. And this is really drawing on lessons that we've seen the oil and gas industry suffer, particularly here in Australia. And as the green hydrogen especially is quite a nascent industry with really just feasibility projects to date, and we don't see that much merit in companies competing against one another. Whilst we see some degree of NOJVs and partnerships around feasibility, we also start to see some of the telltale signs that we saw in the LNG industry, where there's lots of companies going their own path and essentially trying to protect their own IP and to some extent competing rather than collaborating and driving down the total cost to support the industry above their own interests. And then thirdly, in terms of where next, we think the focus needs to shift quite quickly from feasibility into scalability. And that whilst we recognize there is clearly a risk associated with putting significant capital into green hydrogen projects today, that in order to really lead in the industry, they're going to need to see some bolder ambitions. And we see a few flagships already starting to demonstrate this. So to talk to the first point around where do we see the kind of domestic market demand, there's probably four factors that we want to consider. So this is some quick analysis that we ran internally and actually pulls on some global data points as well. So it won't be overly specific to the Australian market. But essentially, we want to be looking for markets that offer sustainability, i.e. which are the sectors that are in need to decarbonize by using hydrogen. Secondly, which are those sectors that can actually afford to, because we also recognize certainly in the near term, the cost to produce green hydrogen means there needs to be a premium to support the production of that, and therefore the relevant sectors need to be able to afford that premium. The third is scalability, which is then clearly to ensure that any investments made to target that sector can be scaled longer term. And obviously that scalability supports lower costs, as well as continued growth of investment. And then the fourth area, more from a technical point, is almost the timing of whether that opportunity exists today, whether the technology applicability is mature enough. So, you know, something in aviation is clearly less mature than if we're talking about gas blending, for example. So when we look across these four areas, and what we're trying to illustrate here is sustainability is indicated on the y-axis, affordability on the x-axis, where sustainability is ESG risk score, affordability is your return on equity for these different sectors, scalability is the bubble size, and maturity is the color coding. What we're really looking for is which of those bubbles that are nice and big, a darker purple, and sit in the top right corner. And, you know, unsurprisingly, there aren't any silver bullets, but there probably are a few areas that kind of, or insights that come out of this one. The first one is the mining industry. Now, especially if we think about iron ore and the prices that they've enjoyed in the last kind of 12 months and potentially in the near term, there's clearly a huge affordability angle there, where although it's not represented in that bubble, because that's a global metals and mining data point. But I think the iron ore miners in the Pilbara are delivering north of 40% return on equity currently. So they clearly have a deep pockets in order to support that, and also a clear demand or signal to move to more sustainable business models and have set out their emissions targets in order to get there. So we see that's a very attractive area to start with. On the contrast side of that, if we look to the left, when we look at steel, then whilst we've seen a lot of news items talk about the potential of green steel, and even some of the iron ore miners talking about integrating downstream into green steel, I think the key challenge there is really the economics of the steel industry by itself, which is really that returns. So, I mean, even over the last 5 years, some of the largest steel companies have failed to deliver returns. And ultimately, there's significant challenges trying to compete with Chinese steel, which is essentially propped up because of national interests rather than economic ones. So whilst there could be the potential for green steel in Australia, the question is, who would really be the investor there, given that it's unlikely to deliver much returns in contrast to green iron ore. So two kind of call outs there. The other one, which I think was mentioned earlier, is gas blending. So clearly the ability to have flexibility around what that offtake would be going into gas supply makes it very attractive for projects that are looking to scale up, and that makes them 2 to 10%, and then how that can start to scale then more broadly. And then also clearly the proximity then that gas blending infrastructure could have with current pipelines and potentially then limited transportation costs. The other area that we've seen a lot of talk around and some of the feasibility projects looking at is the fertilizers and explosives. So whilst that makes sense from an ammonia perspective, given that Australia is a net importer of ammonia, and therefore using green hydrogen to produce green ammonia would follow as a logical consequence. The challenge there is really the size of the bubble or the scale of that market, and the fact that that's significantly smaller than if we look at the metals and mining or the utilities gas markets. So when we're looking at domestic markets, we would think primarily hydrogen for mining, transportation, and gas blending. Then when we start to think about the relationships, so to maybe talk to the left-hand side first and share some of the lessons, if you like, from the oil and gas industry. So I think the oil and gas industry is an interesting case in point because similar type of capital intensity, energy market dynamics, and what we've seen in the last year is really a much bigger focus, certainly globally, for the industry to look at collaborative opportunities to drive down costs or capture shared value, given the price pressure that the industry was under. And if we look at the areas where we would see the largest trapped value or locked in value opportunities, then it's in the capital development space, it's in incremental recovery and shared infrastructure. I think this is really analogous to what we'd expect in green hydrogen around non-standardized plant designs. So having over-design or customization of equipment would limit the ability for scale and sharing in capital development. The incremental recovery is really analogous to surplus power. So especially the designs for or green hydrogen to have surplus renewable power to deliver on electrolyzer capacity is going to see a lot of surplus power potentially wasted. So is there an opportunity to capture a better leverage that? And then thirdly, around the infrastructure is the silo transmission and distribution, or potentially the supply chains, as that's another key area that we've seen in oil and gas. So, what we'd position here is how does the hydrogen industry in Australia need to start to think about establishing itself more collaboratively from the get-go in order to prove the viability of the industry before looking to compete with one another i.e. how do we grow the size of the pie before we're trying to get the largest slice out of it. And we really think there's probably 3 points to focus in order to get there. One of the focus areas needs to be around innovation. So this would be focusing on joint research and development between utilities, different partners, OEMs, to focus on cost. And I think we've seen a lot of those examples in solar PV development, where we've seen a lot of IP being developed locally and then essentially exported for manufacturing in low cost jurisdictions, where that makes more sense. So a big area needs to focus on innovation. The second is around regulation. So standards to obviously not only support the accreditation, if you like, of green hydrogen versus hydrogen from other sources, and with regulation to enable the development and attract capital into this space, but also looking to help drive standardization to improve interoperability of different assets, and support the scalability of those, recognizing as well that, economies of scale is going to be key to drive down that cost point to attract capital for the longer term. And then thirdly, on that point, is also looking at capital partners. So it's a good time we just heard from the CEFC, but recognizing that certainly in the last 6 to 12 months, there's been a significant shift in investor sentiment from legacy energy assets exposed to carbon risk. And, whilst renewable assets typically incur a much lower return compared to oil and gas, there is a large pool of capital out there looking for long-term investments. And that provides a lot of capital financing power, whether talking about sovereign funds or government-backed institutions. But typically, without that degree of leverage, then getting to this point of scale is pretty difficult. So there would be the 3 areas that we really would expect to see partnerships being formed across the industry in order to support the competitive nature of green hydrogen against other means. And then the third area talked about is really that shift from feasibility to scalability. So really what I want to do is illustrate on the left-hand side here some data from ARENA, which shows a number of projects and the typical investment ARENA put in over the last few years. And we can see, in 2018, it was a large number of hydrogen-related projects, and gradually they've become a bigger focus on driving scale there. So I think this year, the 3 projects that went through had just north of 100 million, versus, having circa 20 projects a few years back, significantly smaller and focus more on use cases as opposed to necessarily projects by themselves. But we can still see that those 3 projects are in that kind of 10 megawatt electrolyzer range. Whereas if we start to look at the commercial projects that are still pre-FID, mind you, but they're now starting to scale quite dramatically beyond that. So BP's green ammonia plant I think it's been targeted at 1.5 gigawatt generation. So that's not electrolyzer, but it's generation capacity. Murchison is 5 gigawatts. I think the electrolyzer capacity for that one is around 3. And the Asian Renewable Energy Hub, once it gets through some of the challenges being told at the minute, is clearly a mammoth at 26 gigawatts. So our point being here is, more investment in 10 megawatt feasibility projects is unlikely to add much more. Yes, of course, there's a significant risk with taking on a huge project, but NOJV models offer a good way to mitigate against that. But really, for the industry to move the needle meaningfully, it needs to probably start to look at that 100 megawatt to 1 gigawatt investment that we think moves the industry more towards scalability and supports the growth of the industry as a whole. So that's a quick overview of the publication that we led with, some of the data points. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just keeping an eye on the clock there. and then my details if there are any questions that I can't answer, but let me pause there for any questions.
Thanks for that, Tom. Much appreciated. I do have a few questions which have come through, which is great. First of all, I did notice in the presentation that you mentioned at the start, you were, obviously there was the part that you touched on about encouraging utilities to look domestically rather than internationally. We did have some presentations earlier today which sort of did talk about Australia's sort of inherent competitive advantages internationally. Obviously we have a huge solar resource here. That sort of seems to sort of be slightly different advice to what you're suggesting. Can you sort of just explain the difference there?
Yes, so if I understand the question, it's that there's been a lot of talk that Australia is internationally competitive, so why would the recommendation to be domestic? Sure. So look, I think when we're framing this is very much in a near-term horizon. If we want to build a local industry that has the potential to scale, then the key question would be, why would Australia, as a net importer of ammonia, where ammonia is currently, one of the more cost-competitive transportation methods, look to primarily target export markets? I think export markets are very attractive, given that other governments, especially the likes of Japan, have set very clear emissions targets, and that's really kind of the signal for investment, or what's driving that. But clearly, there's larger transportation costs. And then you are also opening yourself up to more global competition, whether you're looking at green hydrogen coming in from the Middle East, and clearly a lot of funds there with. Oh, sorry, I think I lost you. A lot of deep pockets there looking to kind of make some investments. So it's not to ignore the potential for export markets by any means, but it's to suggest that focusing on domestic should have lower competitive intensity, lower transportation costs, and therefore provide a more pragmatic starting point to scale the industry.
Sure. And I suppose there is an argument for obviously looking at what's going on in our own backyard before we look too far afield. And we certainly don't want to get into a position where we are exporting hydrogen, but then potentially importing other types of fuels, which is sort of what we see a little bit in Victoria and New South Wales at the moment. Excuse me. Another question that's come through is just wanting to know a little bit more about what you were discussing when it comes to utilities moving from that competitive mindset to that collaborative mindset. It's obviously a great idea in theory. What can we do to help encourage energy utilities to shift mindset and really embrace that collaborative attitude? Because it is a bit of a change, obviously. How can we get utilities on board with that idea?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, maybe if I put it another way, look, when we've looked globally and certainly a broader energy context, the two things that have really made collaboration work have been, number one, primarily government intervention, and then secondly, kind of a shared pressure. So, to give you some examples, on the government intervention point, it's where we've seen national oil companies or global or national regulators for the energy fields enforce common standards and requirements to essentially drive collaboration or shared risk reward in different areas, which is easier to do in those instances necessarily here. The second area around shared threat, if you like, you could talk to the North Sea oil and gas sector and saw that once they had aging assets and they felt price point, there's a much greater focus on collaboration. So that's probably a bit more of an organic way. Now, how do you force people to start collaborating? Clearly that comes down to a cultural challenge, which is not going to be easy to do. But I think the challenge is that if that mindset isn't adopted, then it's really going to stagnate the growth of the industry. So, maybe I should have said there isn't a simple answer to that one, but I do think it's key.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's certainly not going to be a straightforward task, but it is, as you say, it is looking like a question of collaborate or perish. So
Mm.
hopefully we can sort of see a bit of that cultural shift and change within the industry. Just looking at the time, I'm going to wrap this session up here and keep things moving. Thank you again, Tom, for joining us today. We really appreciated your presentation and those insights in your responses to our questions there.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks again, Tom. Much appreciated.